Welcome to Tears of Karma. I woke to the hum of a flickering ceiling light and the stale stench of cigarette smoke clinging to the curtains. The motel room was the kind rented by the hour, not for birthdays. Peeling wallpaper curled at the edges like dried skin, and the carpet carried stains too old to remember their origins. It was my 70th birthday, but the only gift waiting for me was silence. The night before, my family had driven me here under the pretense of a surprise. "Don't peek, Dad. You'll love it," my eldest son had said, his grin too wide, his hand too firm on my shoulder. I believed him because I wanted to. I had wanted to believe in them my whole life. When I closed my eyes that night, I thought maybe they had remembered who I was. The man who built their comfort, who paid their debts, who carried their burdens. But in the morning, there was no knock on the door, no laughter spilling from the hallway, no family crowding into the room with balloons and cake. Just an empty silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at my shoes. I had polished them the night before, foolishly expecting to look respectable in family photographs. The irony mocked me. I caught sight of myself in the mirror across the room. My sagging cheeks, the lines etched deep across my forehead, eyes dulled from years of compromise. I looked like a man already buried, waiting for dirt to close over his face. Something shifted inside me then. Betrayal has a sound when it finally lands. It is the crack of glass underfoot, the tearing of cloth too thin to hold weight. My family had abandoned me in this cheap motel, and in that abandonment, they had handed me something far greater than humiliation. They had given me clarity. What they thought was the end of me was only the beginning. I leaned back against the cracked headboard of that motel bed and let the memories spill, uninvited and merciless. The beginning had been so different, so clean, so full of promise. I remembered the smell of fresh plaster when my wife and I first stepped into the house we built with our own hands. Every brick laid, every loan repaid, every night we went hungry so the children could eat. It was a sacrifice I carried with pride. I wanted them to have more than I ever did. The business grew under my calloused fingers. I woke before dawn, swept floors, kept books by candlelight, and still found time to tuck them in at night. My wife stood beside me, her smile a shield against exhaustion. Together, we created a world where our children would never know the kind of hunger or shame we had endured. For years, I thought that love was enough. But time has a way of stripping the varnish off illusions. Gratitude soured slowly, like milk left out too long. Birthdays became transactions. Visits turned into subtle interrogations about bank accounts and property. I began to hear it in their voices, the sharp edge of entitlement dressed in polite words. "Don't worry, Dad, we'll take care of it all one day." One day. Their promise carried the weight of a threat I refused to recognize. After my wife's funeral, everything unraveled faster. Hugs that once lingered grew cold, arms stiff around my shoulders as if touching me were a chore. Smiles faltered the moment I refused a request for money. Love was replaced with calculation, and I became less a father and more a vault waiting to be emptied. On that motel morning, I could no longer lie to myself. The truth came crashing down, brutal and undeniable. They had never wanted me. Not my stories, not my presence, not my love. Only what I could give, what I could bequeath. And I decided then, with a clarity sharp enough to cut through grief, that I would give them nothing. David was always the loudest voice in the room, even as a child, but age had twisted his confidence into arrogance. He strutted through family gatherings like a king awaiting his coronation, already convinced the crown of my labor belonged on his head. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, now glittered only with hunger. He never asked how I was, only what I still owned. Sarah, his wife, played her role with precision. She leaned in close to him, lips curling with suggestions she thought I could not hear. Her poison was sweet, subtle, and it dripped into David's ears until he spoke her venom as his own. She smiled at me with all the warmth of a winter frost. "Every dad," she uttered, coated with contempt. I was not her family, only her obstacle. Elaine broke my heart the deepest. My daughter, once the one who ran barefoot through the garden, who pressed daisies into my palm as if they were treasure, now looked at me as though I were a ledger to be balanced. I had clung to the hope that she would remain untouched by greed, that her tenderness would outlast the years. But her eyes betrayed her, sharp, measuring, cold. She no longer saw her father, only the weight of an inheritance she could not wait to claim. Even Lily and Jack, the grandchildren I once carried on my shoulders, had learned to mirror their parents' disdain. Their laughter was hollow now, their hugs hesitant unless accompanied by an envelope slipped into their palms. They had been taught well. Love was conditional, and affection was currency. That night in the motel, their voices haunted me. "You've lived long enough, Dad. Time to think about the rest of us." The words had been said half-jokingly at the dinner table, but the truth beneath the laughter had cut deeper than any knife. They believed me finished, useless, spent, but I was not finished. And the secret they had overlooked would soon teach them just how wrong they were. The room they thought was my prison was, in truth, my theater. Every peeling strip of wallpaper, every flicker of that buzzing light became part of a stage I had chosen long before they left me there. They believed they had humiliated me, discarded me like trash, but I had been waiting for this moment in silence, sharpening my patience like a blade. I reached beneath the sagging mattress and felt for the envelope, unmarked, ordinary to any careless eye. My fingers brushed its edges, and I pulled it close, cradling it as if it were a living thing. Inside lay the truth of decades. Deeds, account numbers, investments carefully hidden when greed first began to fester in their smiles. My late spouse had urged me once to prepare for storms we could not yet see, and together we built a shelter they would never know existed. Over the years, I had watched them circle like vultures, waiting for my body to cool. With every cutting remark, every impatient sigh, I shifted more into the trust, layer by layer, until nothing of value remained within their reach. They never noticed. Why would they? They were too blinded by their own imagined victory, too certain I had already surrendered. The power in that envelope was absolute. It was the rope that could strangle their ambitions, the knife that could sever their future. I alone held the keys to their salvation, and I had no intention of sharing. The irony burned sweet on my tongue. In abandoning me in this shabby motel, they had abandoned the only lifeline they had left. I could starve them, strip them of every illusion they clung to, and watch as their greedy dreams collapsed into ash. And so, on my 70th birthday, I made my decision. Revenge would be my gift to myself. When I returned home the next morning, the house seemed to inhale in surprise. My key still turned the lock, though I half expected them to have changed it already. The air inside carried the faint sweetness of stale flowers mixed with the bitterness of last night's dinner. They hadn't bothered to clean, certain I wouldn't be back so soon. They scrambled when they saw me, plastering on faces of awkward concern. David's voice broke the silence first. "Dad, we thought, well, there must have been confusion." Elaine nodded too quickly, and Sarah's lips pressed into a thin smile that betrayed her irritation more than her welcome. Their lies were clumsy, but I accepted them with the gentle nod of a man too weary to argue. I sat at the kitchen table, the seat that had once belonged to my wife. Elaine poured tea, her hands steady, but her eyes darted toward David as if awaiting a signal. I lifted the cup, tasting the faint metallic tang of oversteeped leaves. Their excuses droned on, each word a shield meant to deflect guilt, yet all I heard was the steady beat of my own pulse, patient and cold. David's leg bounced beneath the table, impatience twitching through him like an electric current. Sarah's gaze narrowed as if she suspected I knew more than I let on. Across the room, Lily rolled her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching, already mimicking the disdain of her parents. Jack buried himself in his phone, indifferent, certain that I was too irrelevant to deserve his attention. I smiled faintly, letting them believe I had swallowed their story whole. They saw an old man too feeble to notice betrayal. What they didn't see was the blade I was sharpening behind my calm expression. My forgiveness was nothing but a mask, and behind it, their downfall grew nearer with every sip of tea. Weeks passed, and I learned the pleasure of silence. I no longer tried to stop their bickering. I simply watched. Their greed was a fire, and I let it burn. David argued with Elaine in raised voices late into the night, the walls shaking with accusations. "I'm the eldest, it all comes to me," he snapped once, his words leaking through the thin plaster. Elaine countered with shrill defiance, convinced she deserved a greater share for her devotion. The irony made me smile in the dark, for devotion was the one thing neither of them had ever shown. Sarah wove her own web. I overheard her whisper to a neighbor over the fence, feigning pity as she spoke of my supposed confusion. She let her voice tremble as if burdened by concern, though her eyes glittered with anticipation. "He forgets things," she said, planting seeds of doubt. I could see what she wanted: a care home, a signed paper, control slipping quietly into her hands. Even the grandchildren joined the spectacle. Lily mocked my shaking fingers when I held a cup, her laughter sharp and cruel. Jack mimicked my slow steps, dragging his feet across the kitchen floor as if my years were nothing but a joke. Their cruelty was unpolished, still learning, but effective enough to sting. For a moment, humiliation threatened to drag me under. Yet beneath it, I tasted something sharper: triumph. Because I knew what they didn't. Every scheme, every whispered plan, every petty cruelty rested on the same assumption: that I had already handed them everything. They believed they were vultures fighting over a carcass, blind to the fact that the body was still alive, still strong, still holding the keys to the feast they craved. And as their desperation grew, so did my resolve. Their empire of greed stood on sand, and I was the tide waiting to pull it all away. The night I chose to reveal my hand, the house trembled with anticipation. I had summoned them with careful words, promising something important to reveal. Greed drew them together more effectively than love ever had. They arrived dressed as though for a celebration, faces glowing with the certainty that their long wait had finally ended. I sat at the head of the table, the empty chair beside me, my wife's chair, casting a shadow longer than any of them dared acknowledge. David leaned forward first, his hands clasped as though already receiving a blessing. Elaine's nervous smile fluttered, rehearsed in the mirror a dozen times before she arrived. Sarah's sharp eyes glittered with calculation, her lips stretched into a smile too wide to hide her hunger. Even Lily and Jack slouched with the arrogance of inheritors, rolling their eyes yet impatient for the prize. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. Then I placed the envelope on the table. A simple gesture, but their bodies shifted instantly, leaning closer like wolves scenting blood. "It's time," I said softly. "Time you know the truth." Their breaths caught, and for a heartbeat, I almost pitied them. Almost. The will was sealed, notarized, untouchable. I read its contents slowly, deliberately, watching each word carve into them like a blade. Every cent, every property, every share destined for charity, scholarships, and a foundation in my wife's name. Their names were absent, erased as though they had never belonged to me at all. Gasps erupted. David's face twisted, rage clawing through his mask of confidence. Elaine's eyes widened, disbelief choking her into silence. Sarah spat words like venom, her voice trembling with fury. Even Lily and Jack sat frozen, the weight of reality smothering their practiced indifference. I ended the night not with an explanation, but with a smile, because this was only the beginning of their fall. The storm I had unleashed did not crawl, it devoured. Within weeks, cracks appeared in the glittering facade of their lives. Creditors called at odd hours. Letters stamped in red piled high on their counters. The cars they flaunted, the vacations they boasted of, the fine clothes they wore. All of it had been borrowed time, borrowed money. Without the inheritance they counted on, the foundation beneath their arrogance gave way. David came first, his pride shredded. He stood in my doorway one evening, his voice trembling as he pleaded, "Just a loan, Dad. Just until things recover." I watched him, the man who had once told me my time was over, now begging like a pauper. I closed the door without a word. Sarah chose rage over humility. She called, spitting venom into the phone, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, of destroying her family's future. I let her words wash over me like rain on stone. It was not me who had destroyed them. It was their greed. Elaine wept when I saw her, tears streaking down her face, her voice cracking as she whispered, "We have nothing left." But even in her sorrow, I heard it, the demand hidden beneath the grief. She still believed I owed her more than love. The grandchildren turned on their parents, sharp tongues blaming them for the lost wealth that was never theirs. Lily sneered at David, Jack cursed at Elaine, and the family splintered under the weight of its own greed. I stood apart, no longer their victim, but their reckoning. I had become the hand of karma, and it moved through me without mercy. They had left me to rot in a motel on my birthday, never realizing solitude would sharpen me into their executioner. And still I was not finished. When the dust finally settled, I found myself alone again, but this time, the silence no longer cut like a blade. It was a cloak I wrapped around myself, heavy yet comforting. The motel, the humiliation, the ache of being left behind had not destroyed me. They had refined me, stripping away illusions until only steel remained. The house grew quiet in ways I had once feared. No footsteps storming down the hallway. No voices raised in entitlement. No forced laughter scraping against my nerves. Their absence became a gift, and each day I breathed easier without the weight of their demands pressing on my chest. I redirected my energy, pouring what they coveted into hands that had never asked. A scholarship fund bore my wife's name, carrying her memory forward like a lantern. Local charities received checks written with a steady hand, and the look in strangers' eyes when they realized help had arrived, unexpected, undeserved, was more genuine than any gratitude my children had ever given me. I walked through town unnoticed, free from their shadows, content in anonymity. Every time I saw a family embracing, a child tugging at a parent's sleeve, I felt no bitterness. Love existed, just not where I had once planted it. My bloodline had betrayed me, but love was not gone from the world. It had simply shifted, blooming in places untouched by greed. Justice had been served, yes, but more than that, it had been savored. And in the quiet hum of my solitary evenings, I realized revenge was not my ending. It was my beginning. Still, sometimes in the silence, I felt a question stir, faint but persistent. If this was the beginning, what remained for me to finish? Now, as I set pen to paper, I feel the weight of years pressing gently against me. 70 years have carried me farther than I ever imagined. Yet it was betrayal that shaped me, and revenge that carried me further still. My hands tremble as I write, but not from fear, only from the passing of time. Death lingers at the edge of my vision like an old acquaintance, patient, waiting. I do not resist. I do not fear. What I fear is silence, the possibility that my story might vanish before it can serve its purpose. The truth must remain. Betrayal may splinter families, but greed destroys them entirely. My children believed they had cast me aside, left me to fade into obscurity. But the truth is harsher, more final. I abandoned them first. Not with footsteps walking away, but with choices sharper than any blade. Choosing survival over submission, justice over forgiveness, clarity over delusion. The house is quiet tonight. The clock ticks softly in the corner, each beat reminding me of the little time I have left. I picture the foundation bearing my wife's name, already funding lives more worthy than those who shared my blood. Scholarships, shelters, food for the hungry. Her kindness reborn where their greed could not reach. That is the legacy that will outlive me. This confession is my final gift, not to them, but to anyone who dares to mistake weakness for surrender. Let my children find these words one day, if bitterness does not consume them first. Let them read and finally understand that I was never the frail old man they mocked. I was the storm they never saw coming. And even in death, my echo will thunder in the ruins of their ambition.